In a library in Jerusalem lies an intensely curious document. It was written about 300 years ago, and only a handful of scholars have ever examined it. The author was arguably the most important scientist of all time, a genius who uncovered the laws of physics that govern the entire cosmos, Sir Isaac Newton. The subject? Newton's calculation of the date the Bible said the world as we know it would end in the Battle of Armageddon, the year 2060.
If this calculation were correct, then we are close to the time of the end. That's exactly what this sort of calculation would point to.
When this document came to public attention recently, it was headline news. But why was Isaac Newton making this dire prediction?
We find it surprising that Newton sounds like a televangelist talking about the end of time. We only find it shocking because we've made Newton something that he's not. We've made Newton an irrationalist, enlightened image. That's just not Newton.
What these manuscripts reveal is a very different Newton than most people conceive of. This is a Newton who is not a cold, calculating scientist. This is revealing Newton in all his glory, warts and all, if you will.
So who was the real Isaac Newton? On a small farm in rural England called Woolsthorpe, the conflicted life of Isaac Newton began in 1642. That same year, the astronomer Galileo had died, and his work was still sending shockwaves through Europe. Galileo had risked his freedom by challenging the ancient belief held by the Catholic Church that the sun moved around the earth. Based not on faith but observation, he confirmed the earth was just one of several planets orbiting the sun. It was the dawn of the scientific revolution, an age when science and reason would redefine the world.
There was a sense of a whole new era. The very idea of having the empirical world answer our questions, that idea was taking hold in a way that had almost never done so before.
And from a young age, Newton was gripped by this new outlook. As a boy, he pored over a book called The Mysteries of Nature and Art, a manual for building mechanical contraptions and investigating the natural world.
He was preoccupied by the things that preoccupy physicists, by time and motion. So he made windmills, he made little boats, he flew kites that supposedly affrighted the locals. He tied candles to them and they were put up and they thought that they were comets.
But from the start, there was another side of Isaac Newton. His father died before he was born, and when he was just 3 years old, his mother remarried and moved away, leaving young Isaac behind with his grandparents. Newton later confessed to such rage that he wanted to burn his mother and stepfather in their house. And by the time he left home for Cambridge University, Newton had lived through 2 decades of violent political and social turmoil. A bloody civil war, the beheading of the king, and the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II in 1660. At Cambridge, Newton buried himself in his studies.
Truth is the offspring of silence and unbroken meditation.
He didn't go anywhere. I mean, he rarely traveled. He never went to the continent. He was that insular. I mean, he stayed in his rooms. He worked 7 days a week, 18 hours a day, and he pushed himself, drove himself. He had a library of his own that had about 1,600 or 1,800 volumes, but it was very much a world that came to him through printed matter or through manuscripts from others.
The decadent atmosphere of Cambridge was something the reclusive young Newton wanted no part of.
It was a time, particularly after the restoration of Charles II, it was a time of great fun and frolicking, and I think Newton would have been dismayed by many of the antics of his fellow students, drinking, going after bad young women in local villages.
To resist temptation, Newton drew up a plan that he'd stick to for the rest of his life.
The way to chastity is not to struggle directly with incontinent thoughts, but to avert ye thoughts by some employment, or by reading, or meditating on other things, or by converse. For he that's always thinking of chastity will be always thinking of women.
He's a very silent, thoughtful young man who, I suppose, looks as though he's utterly tedious from the outside. There's no evidence, I think, that anyone liked him at all, apart from his friend John Wickens.
John Wickens was another Cambridge student. He and Newton became roommates after both grew unhappy living with students who put pleasure before work.
They have a very peculiar relationship because Wickens is somebody who is of a higher status than Newton at Trinity and seems to have become Newton's amanuensis, i.e. his secretary, over the following 20 years. But they must have been very close. They lived in the same rooms for 20 years.
As a student, Newton devoured the latest scientific ideas. It was widely accepted by this time that the planets orbit the sun. But now the question was, how did the planets move? What held them in their orbits? The most popular theory came from the French philosopher René Descartes, who thought of the universe as a giant machine, like a clock. Descartes said everything, even the orbits of planets, could be explained simply as the physical interactions of parts of this machine. But Newton had trouble accepting this view of nature.
Newton's a very smart guy, and he became convinced that the only types of statements that are acceptable are ones which you could, to put it bluntly, test in the laboratory.
But just as Newton was probing the limits of Descartes, the plague struck England. Thousands died every week. The university closed, and Newton returned home to avoid infection. And it was here, in the apple orchard just outside the family home, that the legend of Isaac Newton was born.
The story, of course, is that he's lying in the garden there, and instead of thinking about girls, he's thinking about the moon and how it goes around the earth and so on. And an apple falls, and the story goes as bang, he suddenly has the idea that the same thing that's making the apple fall is what's holding the moon in its orbit.
Newton told this tale himself in his old age, claiming that with the fall of that apple, he realized that what held the planets in orbit was not a physical mechanism like Descartes' clockwork, but an invisible force he called gravity. And he was convinced that the force pulling apples down to Earth and keeping the moon in orbit around the Earth were one and the same. He stayed up late in the evening, calculating the strength of that force by the light of the fire. But when the numbers didn't quite work out, he put the idea aside. Or so the fable goes.
I doubt that an apple was what stimulated him to get the idea.
It's almost certainly an apocryphal story.
Yeah, I don't think it's even known whether it ever happened.
I'm extremely skeptical about the role of fruit in Newton's life.